Unpopular opinion, I don't think putting rent controls really solves the rental crisis. Well, let's set the premise at the moment, right? Let's acknowledge that the vacancy rate is currently at an all-time low, 1.5%, okay? Previously, it was between 3 to 4% during 2019, and it has been like that. And it took a really big dive, during mid-2022. And I also want to acknowledge that some tenants are experiencing rental stress. And with the high RBA rates, which pass on to the mortgage holders, landlords are forced to raise the rents, and some of them are skyrocketing. But I will still argue and prove my point here that advocating for rent price controls is not a viable solution to solving the rental crisis we have at the moment. But before I break down my own argument, let's explain why there is a rental crisis. And the first number one reason why the rent vacancy is so low is because there's a lot more renters living alone. Like basically after the pandemic, everyone's just been following Jason Derulo. To quote Mr. Derulo, everyone wants to feel like a rock star, can't stop their shine, are living on cloud nine. I'm riding solo. I mean, what happened to living in a one-bedroom apartment in Harris Park with 30 of your other mates? Oh, I'm sorry. That was my old mate Raj from India. Hey, I'm not being casually racist. I did watch Triple R, which I loved. It sort of feels like On Buck meets Yip Man with a sprinkle of Bollywood. And let's go back to the valid points and segue to migration. So one of the second points of why rent vacancy is so low is because there's an increase of migration. Third important point is with the increase of high rates, a lot of investors are selling out, which means the homes are no longer rented out. It's all owner-occupiers. Look at this graph by PopTrack. You can see that the rent in terms of house and unit has definitely, taken a big, sharp increase during 2020, 21 to now. Now let's talk about the rent controls that are in place right now. In terms of proposed rent controls, we have like the opposite extremes. We have the hard approach and the soft approach. So the hard approach is basically rent freeze, and the soft approach is rent stabilization. There's a lot of proposals in the the New South Wales and the Queensland government in terms of rent caps. For example, landlords are not able to increase rent to a certain amount, and that is fixed for a certain amount of time. As for the soft approach, which is rent stabilization, it's uncapped, so landlords can increase the rent, but then there is like the limit on how quickly rent can increase for these type of properties that are for rental. Now you got to understand in terms of history, this is not the first time Australia has proposed rent controls. As you can see here, Australia in terms of 1940s or during World War II, the Commonwealth has enforced fixed rents. Then that makes sense. That was World War II. We're not in World War III. We're not fighting against Russia or China at the moment. Now, either way of you choosing to propose rent controls, either you go hard or you go 50 shades of soft on, tenants, let's highlight the cons. One of the cons I could think of is that landlords will secure and opt in for shorter terms. Shorter the contract means, the contract can then reset for a new tenant to then have the ability to raise the rent for that new tenant. But then this proposes a challenge for families who want longer term lease, but then landlords are like, no, I'm not going to lease it to you because there's no opportunity to raise rents because you're protected by all these soft and hard rent controls. Since there's no more incentive for us landlords to buy a property, well, then developers are not going to build more property because there's no buyers. Another way that we landlords will play around these rent controls is that we'll be picky in terms of the property we want to buy. We'll definitely pick suburbs that basically don't have or attract those type of tenants that complain about the rent. Basically, those of us who have a bit of low-end housing in our portfolio, we'll sell them, and then basically we'll move on to more high-end housing. Those more reputable or more high-income suburbs. So visualize this: if you're in Sydney or Western Sydney, all the landlords will sell off, and then we'll all flock over to the North Shore, where there won't be a lot of rent controls, and buy there and rent there. That's called a spillover effect. So is that going to increase the rental crisis even more? Yes, in a different proportion, which is the poor gets punished. And then you say, Q, what is the pros of rent controls? What are the pros? Well, to be honest, there isn't any, because the only solution is this. The only solution is to raise the government rent assistance. The government makes a lot of money in terms of us investors in terms of stamp duty. Stamp duty is the government's cash cow. Stamp duty was the only reason that we got ourselves out of recession in terms of a deficit. So use part of that bloody money to raise the government rent assistance for those who can't afford the bloody rent. Or maybe bloody have more affordable housing, build more homes. Can the government put more money into the property market and build more homes rather than spending $300 billion on 3 submarines? Why is the onus on us landlords to freaking not raise the rents? Our mortgage is going up high. What, are we Mother Teresa? Are we opening a charity? The most important question is, what do you think? Do you think rent controls really help with the rental crisis? Jump in the comments, either roast me or toast me. Love to read your comments.